Hello, and welcome to episode 96 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Scottsdale, Arizona, I'm Nick Sautra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Charles Pence, philosopher and historian of science and technology, working as Chargé de cours, equivalent of associate professor, at the Université catholique de Louvain in Belgium. Charles leads a committed group of scholars working to understand the philosophy, history, and ethics of science and technology. The group, under the name the Pence Lab, creates a wide variety of research products, including academic books and papers, and materials for public audiences. The lab also gives talks to groups of specialists and the public worldwide and produces widely used open source software. The lab's current projects include the stability of regulators in embryonic development, conceptual uncertainty in biodiversity and taxonomy, the foundations of natural selection and the causal structure of evolution, the history of biology, and work in the digital humanities that takes the pulse of the current biological literature. When he's not working, which is fairly rare, Charles is an avid marathon runner, technology addict and computer programmer, clarinet player, gaming aficionado, and audiophile. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Charles. Dr. Charles Pence, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Friday?
Doing fantastic. Thanks so much.
Nice. How's the evening there over there in Brussels?
It's we've had a bit of a heat wave, but it finally broke today. So everybody's. I actually imagine it's going to be a very busy evening this evening. It's lovely weather for once.
What happens in the evening of the weekends in Brussels?
I actually live smack downtown in a really lively neighborhood. So, I'm surrounded by fun bars and restaurants. So yeah, I imagine, there's a festival kicking off in the neighborhood tomorrow too. So yeah, I think people are going to be out. People are going to be out having fun tonight.
Oh, that sounds so lovely. I miss travel. I really would. I miss the European travel. And I imagine, especially in the summertime, it's just so nice and the energy's out. And so,
when we're not heat waving, it really is a delightful thing.
Right. Well, yeah. So you're, tell me, where are you doing research and teaching nowadays?
Yeah, so I've for 6 years now, I've been at the Université catholique de Louvain, which is the francophone of the two sister universities. You may have also heard of KU Leuven. That's the Dutch-speaking one on the other side of the linguistic barrier here in Belgium. So yeah, I've been teaching in the philosophy department there for about 6 years now.
Wow. And how has your time been so far?
It's been really great. This is a wonderfully welcoming academic community. Belgium has, I think, treated me really fantastically well. Of course, emigrating is tough for lots of reasons, obviously, but no, it's a very relaxed environment. The students are fun. The research community is phenomenal. So it's been a really great move. I'm really happy.
I'm happy to hear that. And so in terms of summertime, is there teaching duties, or is this a time to get back into one's research or conference travel? What do you find yourself getting up to?
My summer, so this happens to be a light summer for conferencing. So I'm going to take a little bit of vacation, but mostly I'm going to give you the standard academic answer, right? Which is this is when I'm going to catch up on all the stuff that I'm behind deadlines on.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I could also be catching up on rest too. I don't know. That could be something that we
a little bit when I can. I hope. I'd like to. But yeah, no, we don't. We have a bit of a summer exam period in August, but mostly no. It's fairly quiet, so it's a good time to put the nose to the grindstone a little bit.
So now it's a French-speaking university. So did you, in terms of speaking French, are you fluent? Did you learn French growing up? What?
I'm mostly fluent now. I think it's fair to say. It's hard to judge your own skill, but no, I actually started learning the language when I got the job offer.
No
I did
way.
not know French before I went in. I guess this is, proof that you should never count yourself out of a job search. I saw this job ad come across, I think, Philos L or something, right? Yeah. And at the risk of exposing my own laziness a little bit in public, dashed off a job application in about an hour with my template materials, doing almost no customization, because I was telling myself, look, they're not going to hire an American who doesn't speak French, who doesn't know anybody at this institute. Turns out, at least I thought that at the time. I actually had some a bit of recognition of a couple of the people here.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, by and large, I was like, look, I have no hope, right? So I launched this job application into the void, and 6 years later, here I am, tenured and happy. So never count yourself out ahead of time.
No, I love that. I recently came across like a fellowship position, but I saw it was in Germany, but it did require expectation of sort of a command of the German language. And so I thought, well, I mean, again, there's sometimes that's going to be the kind of starting requirement. So in terms of that, I'm just curious, how did you break the barrier in terms of then teaching your first classes, or, what did you do?
Yeah, I mean, I did get, to be fair, the university was very helpful. So I got a decent amount of time one-on-one with a language tutor, which was very nice of them, and I imagine fairly expensive. So that was great. But then, yeah, I just sort of, threw myself into some online courses, reading courses, reading the newspaper every single day, which I still keep up, that kind of thing. It is easier than you think if you force yourself to do the immersion. I think that's one of the big keys, right? Is that, I don't think I could have ever picked up the language if I hadn't moved to somewhere where they speak
just
it.
Continuously living in English speaking world or something like that. Yeah.
The first course I gave fully in French in real life, I will remember forever, because that was like a peak terror moment. Yeah. I have a very, very clear memory. I teach a course in philosophy of animals and animal ethics in our veterinary program. It's to first year students in the veterinary program. Super fun, pretty relaxed, because they're first years, and we're not trying to turn them into philosophers. We're just trying to give them a bit more of an image of, here's another way that you could look at your field and the kinds of things you're doing. And so I'm giving this like very broad day of first day of intro, and we get to the break in the middle, and a guy in the front row raises his hand, and I'm like, oh no, this guy's gonna tell me like, hey man, we don't understand a word you're saying. Like, sorry, but your French is horrible. And I'm freaking out. And I walk over to the guy, and he just stares at me for a second, really confused. And his one question is, why did you come to Belgium? In hindsight, it makes sense. I mean, self-deprecation is like a very deep and profound part of the Belgian character. It's really funny.
That's interesting.
All the locals think their country is terrible, which is hilarious because it's lovely.
I love that. I love that ability to tell. It's just an inviting, rather than make fun of others, make fun of oneself in a way. It makes you more connected. I think that's wonderful. It was super fun. That was nice. It kind of broke the ice for me. And the second half of the course was easier, because it was like, okay, if that was the only question he had, then I think I'm going to live. Like, the students are on your side. They're kind of they're like, you can be with us in terms of this thing. And that's really good. I'm really happy to hear that. Well, I'm excited to hear, that's obviously like coming into that story. That's fascinating. The way you've transitioned. I would love to get up and continue to hear more about what's going on with you. But first, let's take a step back and hear how you got into philosophy of science to begin with, and a little bit more about your background. So tell us, Charles, where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I am from to be fair, I was born in Houston, Texas. Okay. But we moved away when I was little, so I don't remember that really well at all. So I say that I am from a tiny town of about 5,000 people, about a half hour outside of Austin, the town of Bastrop, Texas. Which I am extremely lucky to have had my parents discover and move to when I was 5, because it had at least in the 13 years that I was a part of it, really fantastic public school system. So I was very lucky. To get a bunch of fantastic teachers at a nice, fairly small, kind of nurturing town. It was very much a, go out and play all day in the playground and don't have to worry about it. Just kind of upbringing.
No, that sounds great. What kinds of things were you interested in growing up? What were you getting into?
Yeah, so I mean, I was definitely always a nerd. Like that was true from ground zero. Which anybody who knows me will be able to fully confirm. It didn't wear off. I'm definitely still a massive nerd. So yeah, that was sort of there from day one. I'm from, if you will, an academic extended family. So my grandfather was a professor. My mom's dad was an English professor, a scholar of Mark Twain. Wow. And so I grew up kind of always, pretty much from as long as I can remember having a formulated thought about what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a professor. That was like, I saw that life. I saw him interacting with his PhD students and kind of what he got to do and what his life looked like. And it was just like, this is the jam. This is what I want to do. Yeah. But I didn't know of what. I had no idea of, I domain was kind of wide open. I was always really, excited by the sciences of various shapes and forms. I kind of went through lots of phases. I was a little boy once. So of course, paleontologist was on the table for a while.
Yeah,
sure. Every small boy.
I want to study dinosaurs. Jurassic Park. Let's go.
Who wouldn't? Yeah. Archaeology took a turn. Biology took a turn. Then actually, funnily enough, so around kind of my early teenage years, really what settled in, the answer wound up being physics. So I was ready. I was done. I was on the track to become a theoretical physicist when I took off for college. That was absolutely what I was sure that I wanted to go do.
Wow. Okay. So, that's something. So, okay. Tell us a little bit about that. What does it mean to then go on and try to become a theoretical physicist?
Yeah. So I did what many, kids from the middle of nowhere, who wanted to get away would do, which is to say I trawled through all of your lists of colleges, looking for things that were good at physics and far away from where I was. So I scattered college apps all over the world, or not all over the world, all over the country. I wasn't quite brave enough to think about leaving the US. And wound up, heading off for, I thought at the time, heading off for the astrophysics program at Princeton. I was sure that was going to be my degree.
Wonderful. What was it like studying astrophysics at Princeton?
I did 2 years. I think this is where the shift happens. So the first of the shifts. So yeah, I survived 2 years. And it was delightful. To be fair, the professors were great. The environment was great. What I quickly came to learn, that I was not expecting at all is that the introductory year's worth of physics that I was taking as a kid from public school in the middle of nowhere in Texas, everybody else in the room but me had basically already taken these courses in their high schools. And I was about a year behind the room. That was a pretty nasty introduction to academic inequality. And so it took me 2 years of kind of getting beaten up by exams. But I started to think about what else I could be interested in. But then I got lucky. I am also the poster child for distribution requirements. So whatever required courses, what have you, whatever your university calls these, curriculum diversity, whatever terms you use, I am the reason that they are a good thing, or at least a good example. I signed up in the spring of my sophomore year for logic. Precisely because I was thinking to myself, well, look, there's this area requirement that we have that's called epistemology and cognition. A lot of these are psychology courses. I don't really care about psychology, but logic's mostly math, and I'm good at math. So probably I'll just be able to crush this class and everything will be fine. Except it turned out that logic course was taught by Hans Halvorsen.
What is
Hans?
Hans? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just for those who might have not have heard. I'm curious.
No. Well, very well known general philosopher of science, philosopher of physics, has done a lot of great work in philosophy of quantum mechanics. And what's more, all around spectacular, wonderful human being, was an just amazingly good mentor to me as an undergraduate, because here I am, vaguely struggling, also kind of realizing that the questions that I'm dealing with in physics are not the things about science that I thought I was interested in. And then I pull up Halvorsen's CV, and he's publishing articles in some of the best physics journals on Earth, as well as in philosophy journals. And so at some point, I forget exactly when, I essentially go to his office and just say, look, man, I need you to tell me, what do you do? I don't understand. How do you exist? What is your deal?
How do you do this? How do you do
And he sort of explained to me, look, there's this thing. You probably haven't heard of it, I guess. It's called the philosophy of science. Here's the kinds of questions that we ask about the sciences. And it didn't take me very long to realize that, the stuff that I thought I was interested in doing in the sciences is the stuff that philosophers of science were doing. I was interested in science not because I wanted to solve a lot of triple integrals, which seemed to be my main job as a physics bachelor student. I was interested in science because I wanted to know how scientific knowledge got generated and how science works and what the reason is that this process is here and how it can be so apparently good at what it does. And I finally realized, actually a lot of practicing scientists, when I ask them this after class, they look at me like I'm a space alien.
Really, we don't ask those kinds of questions. What are you talking about?
Yeah, are you okay? Don't you have homework to do?
Yep.
So that was my then I changed majors. I promptly filed paperwork that fall and became a philosophy major. And so I finished out as a philosophy major there.
So it sounds like the professionalization or treating this as a professional endeavor, becoming a professor was the goal. So how did you then go about realigning things from starting off in the sciences and then having switched into philosophy? What kinds of things did you do? Did that involve, specific, a shift in focus or a shift in thinking? What did making that transition look like?
Yeah, I did. I definitely did do a lot of reading. I mean, I always sort of felt, so for example, I never actually took an intro to philosophy course or an intro to ethics course, right? You had to take one course at the introductory level, but hey, I'd already taken logic and that one counted.
It's more common than you would imagine. A lot of folks coming into philosophy of science, well, especially from the sciences, they didn't have bachelors in, the full on, sort of gamut of philosophy. I imagine maybe later on, but you're right. Those sort of introductory sort of, intro to philosophical problems or intro to ethics, just you go back and pick it up as you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, exactly. I spent summers trying to devour philosophy books as best I could, oftentimes not.
Yeah.
If I could go back in time, I don't imagine that I understood what I was reading really.
Right.
First summer after I decide I want to be a philosophy major and I'm cracking open that every man's library little collection of Plato's dialogues, right? And I'm I don't think now in hindsight, I'm thinking back, I'm I bet I didn't really understand what I was dealing with. But I enjoyed it. I had a great time. And it was absolutely a reorientation in thinking. I mean, I still remember there were habits that died hard. Maybe the funniest example is again, a memory that I can still call to mind very clearly. I think it was also that first summer. It's the first time I read Kuhn's Structure. Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I remember at that point, essentially still a physics student, that book infuriated me. I was like, who is this guy? What is this relativistic nonsense? I don't even begin to understand what do you mean that you can't derive Newton's theory from Einstein's theory? You just don't understand what you're saying. I was fully brainwashed in scientist mode. And, now I teach Structure of Scientific Revolutions every single year to my students, and it makes more sense now I learn something. I still learn things from it every time I read it. It's been a dozen times now, but now it's one of my favorite books in the field. So it really is. It was a mental gymnastics moment, I think.
That's excellent. Okay. No, I appreciate you sharing a little bit about that. And I can relate certainly with the sort of going back, spending that sort of almost downtime, trying to sort of assess, also being frustrated by this, but it's just because you're not familiar with this kind of expository writing and just the way you're thinking about it, and it coming from a sort of I'm just going to tell you how I think it is. Like, it just feels off it maybe at first, but then the more you engage with it, the more you understand the motivation and the value of that. So, yeah. So I noticed here that you had the opportunity to do your graduate training at Notre Dame. Is that right?
Yeah. So this is sort of the next big shift, because of course you'll note that I'm not a philosopher of physics.
Actually, I don't want to skip over that. So we've started with so from early childhood to astrophysics to physics to I'm going to be not a theoretical physicist, but a philosopher of physics, which does exist. Okay.
That was 100% the plan at the end of my undergrad, and so I applied to grad schools looking at who's good at philosophy of, especially philosophy of quantum mechanics. I was sure that was where I was headed.
Yeah.
And so I shipped off to Notre Dame largely because they were interested in my file. There were three or four schools that really showed, kind of bit on my writing sample and CV. And Notre Dame was extremely kind from the get-go. I really got the vibe that, Don Howard had seen something in my file, and, philosopher of physics, philosopher of science there, and wanted to see me show up there. And that, of course, is always, to a budding scholar, that's a good vibe.
Yes.
And so, I headed off there with, kind of a bit of trepidation, on the one hand. So there were two people working in philosophy of physics, about the time I sent in my application. And there was also the big unknown quantity, which was that Notre Dame is an HPS program. It's an integrated history and philosophy of science program. And I sort of to be frank, I was sort of gritting my teeth when I left. I was like, I don't really care about history. I'm a pure philosopher, but, it'll be fine. I'll live. I'll take some history classes. It'll be okay. And then when I arrived, I sort of got swept into what turns out would be my final kind of major career shift, which is to become what I am now, a philosopher and historian of biology. So I was taking classes and working a bit with the people who I might have worked with in philosophy of physics, but both of them sort of, winds of academic change had kind of carried them to different projects that weren't exactly where I thought I wanted to be working. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, well, maybe I could still make this work, but it's not as sort of natural of a fit as I thought it was when I came here. So about the same time, I stumbled into the guy who would become my graduate advisor, Grant Ramsey. And he had an open project. He was interested in some fundamental concepts in evolutionary theory. In particular, he'd done some work on fitness. And he said, look, you're come from this kind of quantitative side. I feel like there's a quantitative project here that, he's not really a math guy. He was like, you want to do the math? Like, I think there's math to do. There's good, interesting quantitative modeling to be done here. And I said, sure. I got a summer. I'm not really doing anything. So I locked myself in the math library and started working on modeling fitness and that was really the beginning of the end, because we got on really well. We worked really well together. Around about the same time, I was taking some great courses in the history of biology with Phil Sloan at Notre Dame, who then proceeded to completely brainwash me into becoming a part-time historian. I'm now a card-carrying member of the integrated HPS fan club. And so that was go ahead.
Well, I was saying, so I remember, there are some interesting positions on HPS, and for those who don't come from a historical bent, there can be some, once again, trepidation, just like maybe even the trepidation toward just philosophy in general when you come from the sciences. And then so what is it about history of science or HPS in general that you started realizing or you found to be worthwhile to pursue and relevant to your progress as a thinker?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that for a long time. I'll try to be brief.
Sure, yeah.
I guess that, so I can think of two things that really were meaningful to me. And one, this is probably either is or is nearly a quote from a history and philosophy of quantum mechanics seminar that Don Howard gave while I was there at Notre Dame. I've become pretty firmly convinced that if you don't understand how it is that philosophical questions in the philosophy of science took the form that they have, you don't really understand the questions in the first place. If you understand that historical trajectory, how did we come to think that this was a problem that was worth solving? And what's interesting about that is that in the philosophy of science, usually, that's not just a history of philosophy question. I think in general, philosophers are pretty okay with the idea of that claim writ large, right? Like, if you work in ethics, you know that how we got to the point of having the kind of, whatever the menu of major normative ethical theories that we have today, like that's a historicized question. We do go back and read the people who are responsible for things being the way they are now. But in philosophy of science, if you really push on that, you very quickly wind up having to do history of science. The reason that philosophical questions in evolutionary theory have the shape that they do has a lot to do with what Darwin wrote and what people responding to Darwin between 1880 and 1950 wrote about the theory of evolution. And so that right off is a kind of nice morsel to get you started being interested. And then when you go there, this was the big conversion experience for me. Once you go there, you start to realize, and these scientists are doing great philosophy too. If you really deconstruct what they're doing, if you really try to take apart their positions, their papers, a lot, especially in the early days when everybody's confused, when people don't know what's going on, they're making great, interesting philosophical arguments, or sometimes equally important, really bad, interesting philosophical arguments.
Yeah.
But that could be cool too. And so that package just kind of turned into what is now, a kind of mid-grade obsession. Certainly has remained one of the major strands of my career, with thinking about the kind of first 50 or 75 years of the theory of evolution, because there is this period of just kind of rank confusion among the scientific community, which is just so fruitful if you're a philosopher.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I know I can definitely relate in terms of understanding like the relevance of history before, not having done so before, than myself having a lot of exposure to integrated HPS. But as we know, a lot of philosophy of science is done outside of history or separate from history. So it's always good to kind of refer to that and encourage those to take a history class or two, or just, be willing to sort of be exposed or just take a little bit of time. Doesn't mean you have to become an integrated HPS or a historian of science, but just, I think it's helpful.
Yeah. So the sociological dimension is certainly interesting, but that would be it. That's a different rant for a different day.
Oh, right. Of course. We could go into that as well. All right. So the transition then, I appreciate you sharing. So the transition into history and philosophy of biology was set in motion. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about, so what were the main projects or questions that were driving you? And then what projects ultimately came out of those questions? So things that you were trying to answer, and then maybe some of your major works in the philosophy of science and philosophy of biology.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of what I've done since really is inspired by the sort of orientation that I took in graduate school, although now broadened out with the addition of a bunch of crazy side projects. But, my PhD work was largely focused around questions of chance and evolutionary theory. So one thing that makes evolution really interesting, right, is that it doesn't describe something that feels like a Newtonian law. It describes a sort of tendency. You don't get a guarantee that the fittest will outcompete in the long run. Yeah, they probably will. We think they will. Normally they will.
Yeah, that's
and that's made people uncomfortable since 1859, right? That's been a persistent source of discomfort. It's not even true. It made Darwin uncomfortable since the mid 1830s, even before he had published the theory. So that right off is a cool epistemological question, and so it sort of bifurcated my career, which is, I think, when I started to get sort of weirdly diverse portfolio of philosophical interests. Half of that looks like, in the contemporary context, trying to think about what is it that makes evolutionary explanations tick. So what is the causal structure of evolution? How does that work? What are the central concepts that you need to put into that causal structure? So how does natural selection work? What is fitness about? What is genetic drift about? How do we combine those with increasingly, I'm trying to think about how we combine those with molecular level explanations, what people are doing in molecular or developmental biology. But that kind of what is the theory really like? Always, at least often, still with an eye toward that's going to give us probabilistic or statistical explanations in the end. So how does that exactly work? We don't think there's anything fundamentally probabilistic about a squirrel getting some food and having some babies or something, right? But somehow, somewhere above there, we wind up with probabilistic knowledge, and that's just a lovely test case for all kinds of different questions in contemporary philosophy of science.
Yes, absolutely.
And then the evil twin of that, or the good twin, I don't know, take your pick, of that is doing that, looking at those same kinds of questions, but historically, and so that. That's been the other side of my work. So there's a lot of movement on exactly those questions in a collection of really interesting biologists from Darwin himself in the mid 19th through about, I've studied it through about 1930 or so, although you could keep going. And that historical side has been really illuminating, again, for precisely that second reason that I said before. These guys are doing cool philosophy of science. They have interesting ideas about what explanation is, and how explanation in biology looks or doesn't look like explanation in physics, or how explanation in biology can still be scientific even if it kind of violates what feels like the norms of good Newtonian science.
Do you have a favorite scientist who is a philosopher, who early 20th century, late 19th century, who's like a philosopher who that you either like like them for their good and or bad philosophy?
Yeah, I can jump on the promo bandwagon. There's like 4 or 5 of us who've done some work on a somewhat neglected biologist, largely because he left his best work unpublished when he died. Watch this space. There's a long, languishing critical edition of this manuscript that I swear we're going to publish someday. Me and Greg Raddick and Yafeng Shen have been poking at this for a very long time. But this is a W.F.R. Weldon, who is a delightfully interesting character. It's tough to work in the late 19th century, a bit less morally reprehensible than most of the other people who are working in this time period, which helps. Not as dislikable. And has extremely interesting by contemporary standards thoughts about all of those questions that I just laid out about what is an evolutionary explanation? What kinds of explanations does evolution give us? How does that relate with cellular level biological processes? How does that relate with statistics and mathematics? How should we understand all of this? He really had, so it's a real pity that he died of pneumonia or pneumonia. I always forget, at 36. Moral of the story to the early career scholars in the audience: you can work yourself to death. Do not work yourself to death. I know. But yeah, cool figure.
Great. No, I always find that just interesting. And whenever I've spoken with folks, there's always these scientists I've never heard of, or maybe I've read very briefly of, but unless you do the history or unless you're very familiar with the history, you might not get to know them, but they've done some really interesting work, or they've made you think about something in a way that you find you were very appreciative of.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Well, could you share? Okay. So, you found your way into history and philosophy, biology. You've been motivated by those questions of explanation, and what, kind of how explanation works in evolutionary theory. So tell us about one or two sort of the main works now as a working philosopher of science, and a historian and philosopher of science that you feel are best representative of your thinking, or maybe, pushed your thinking a little bit further.
Yeah. Of my own works, you mean?
Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah. Of you. So now this is your time of in terms of your research, what are things you're most known for, or you feel like have been best received?
I'm lucky enough to be able to say each of those projects has recently turned into, each of those kind of strands of my work has recently turned into a small to medium sized book.
Okay.
So on the historical side, this now came out, I think the publication date's 22. With Elsevier, I've got a kind of survey of exactly this period. So it's a historical and philosophical reconstruction. This is the rise of chance in evolutionary theory. A historical and philosophical reconstruction of all of these moves about concepts of chance, concepts of probability, statistical theorizing as they're deployed by these different biologists in this fast moving community in this period where precisely, nobody really knows what to do with evolution yet. We don't have the kind of stable modern textbook theory that we all know is developed over the course of the mid-20th. And so they don't have that yet. They're all kind of fumbling around trying to figure out what that could mean. So that's on the history side. And then on the contemporary side, I really enjoyed, I got the chance to put together one of these small Cambridge elements. These are, if readers aren't familiar, this is super cool. Strong recommend to bookmark the series page, not least because, all of the Cambridge elements, right when they publish, they're free for 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
So if you get the hit on an RSS reader or something, right?
It's actually good to know, because I didn't realize. Yeah, I knew there's sometimes free, but you're right, only for a few days. So that's good to know. Okay.
Yeah, it's super cool. So I got to write one on the causal structure of evolutionary theory, and so there is this debate in contemporary philosophy of science. It's been raging for a bit more than 20 years now, about how to think about probabilistic statistical causation in the case of evolution. And so I tried in that book to kind of step back from the debate. It's not really a reconstruction of the debate, because I just didn't think that would be useful. Everybody who's working in the debate knows that reconstruction already. What I hoped to do in the book was to take a step back from the kind of blow by blow and think about what more broadly is at stake. What kinds of questions does the existence of this debate really mean, or are important for us, right? So I think the fact that this debate is around and has been hard to resolve for so long points to a really interesting kind of collection of worries about multi-level statistical probabilistic theorizing in the sciences. Some of which might be proper to biology, but actually I think many of which might not be. There's interesting analogies with, philosophy of mind, for example, or philosophy of social sciences, philosophy of economics, where we think we have a bunch of small scale stuff that also gives rise to a bunch of large scale stuff, but there's just wild probability and stuff floating, or statistics floating around all over the place.
Yeah. Wonderful. So, well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing a little bit about those two projects, or those two strands as well, and seeing as they've come on board with, actually have, made it out into the world. That's always a good sign. So before we hopped on, you mentioned you something about having a number of potential side projects that you've managed to weave together, and I love that because I relate a lot, because I love doing so many different things. I have to stop myself from doing things because I know it will just take me down another. I'm often motivated by that sort of quest for interest, those interests, and it's, sometimes you have to reel it back in, but sometimes you can be really good at doing a number of things. So for someone who it sounds to be successful at that, tell us about some other projects you're up to, that you like to do.
Yeah, no, I totally empathize with that. I mean, I think one reason that I wind up doing this is something about the way my brain works. If I get stuck on a project for more than about 48 hours, the best thing in the world for me to do is to pick up something else, right? So it's nice to have enough of a supply of something else's that I can go, grab another one that maybe hits a different part of the brain.
Supply of something else's. I love that phrasing, by the way. But yes, yeah, and that's a really positive framing too, especially of not just getting stuck on something else. It's amazing how the brain works at that, how creativity and productivity and just general connection with ideas works. All right. Well, so when you're, if you're stuck on something, what else do you pick up?
So I have, the big things have been, this also dates back to graduate school, although I've really taken off with it, since I left Notre Dame. I've been working a lot on uses of digital humanities, text analysis, big data type questions in philosophy. So I do think this is really important. I also think, important caveat, right? There's an insane amount of hype here and we don't want to get carried away. But I think there's all kinds of interesting things we can ask. If in addition to doing close readings of philosophical papers, and especially more importantly of scientific papers, in addition to doing close readings where we try to understand what is it that biologists are up to, if I can reinforce that close reading by saying, also, I did an analysis on 300,000 papers in evolution, and it backs up my philosophical reading for the following kinds of reasons. I think that's a really powerful kind of tool. What else it does that's really fun is it lets me collaborate with all kinds of fun people. So I've made it a thing for a long time now that we're super open. We have these tools. We have a bunch of journal articles that we have in a corpus, available and processed, ready to go. And, basically anybody who thinks they can do something cool with the data that we have, I'm willing to go if I have the time. So
you mentioned something like digital humanities and you say do cool stuff with the data. Well, what does that mean? Like, what can you do with this?
Yeah.
Because
so let me give a couple of examples, at the risk of, unblinding a couple of papers that are under review to peer reviewers who might be podcast listeners. For example, I had a discussion with a philosopher and a master's student in the U.S. About the concept of progress in evolutionary theory. So long-running, interesting question. Does evolution have a kind of progressive bent to it? It sort of feels like it does, because we would like to think that the world now is more complex in interesting ways than it was 5 billion years ago at the first emergence of life. But it turns out that actually putting your finger on what that complexity is super hard. Anyway, one question that you might be interested in asking is, well, how have scientists thought about progress? And how has their thought about that been reflected in what they've published? And how has that reflection changed over time? And so we can take the full print run of a general biology journal as it happens, that analysis is in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, so the biological arm of the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London. And we can look at how that discussion flows and moves and shifts over time. Where do they talk about it? So when they're talking about progress, what else are they talking about when they talk about it? What does it associate with? What kind of company does it keep? How much do they talk about it? It turns out they talk about it less and less in their theoretical science papers, but it looks like they talk about it more and more when they're trying to defend science to the general public. That's cool. And that's the kind of, that kind of helps us orient. It's not going to, I think it's a real mistake to think that these kinds of tools answer philosophical questions, right? But that really helps me then orient my philosophical thinking about what kinds of, potential philosophical hypotheses about those concepts are just ruled out because look, that's just not what scientists do. That's a nice tool to be able to have in your back pocket.
I love that. I love the idea of it shifting. Well, especially providing additional context, providing the things with which what the company, what specific concepts keep, and also a narrowing in on the focus of the relevant philosophical questions. I think that's really helpful. So
yeah, for me, I always like the metaphor. I think there's a paper that I try to defend this in. It's finally going to come out here pretty soon. I've always liked the metaphor of saying that it's really helpful for doing something like cartography. It's hard for us to do that. It's hard for us to map all of science. But these tools can really help you do that. And if you've got a good map, I think you do better philosophy.
I like that. The map is that's a very helpful one. Okay. So you mentioned, digital humanities, any other projects, any other things that you find yourself thinking about?
Yeah. So the other thing that really quite literally fell in my lap, and this is kind of the exciting thing for my next 4 years.
Wonderful.
This is kind of, leans toward a kind of future perspectives idea. I got approached out of the blue by a group of 3 developmental biologists, last year who basically had an idea for a way to rethink some very classic questions about gene regulation, how gene regulation works, to add a little bit of extra biochemistry to the way that we've told those stories. And they want to do a bunch of wet lab work, but they said, hey, we feel like this is philosophically interesting. Do you think this is philosophically interesting? And it turns out I do genuinely think that it is philosophically interesting. And so we were lucky enough to get funded for a mixed project with 3 biologists and a philosopher, 4 PhD students, 3 in biology, 1 in philosophy, to sort of dive in and think about, really doing work, in direct dialogue with practicing scientists. And so for me, that's new. I haven't been in an institutional situation yet before, just now, that really let me do that kind of work. I think it's super exciting and should be really fun. But at least for me personally, that's a new chapter because I haven't had the chance to be that closely locked in with scientific practice before.
Well, I gotta say, scientists approaching you, it's usually the other way around. In my experience of referring to, speaking with a number of philosophers of science, or sometimes it's mutual, but having a group approach you and say, hey, we like your work, or we see a real value in kind of thinking about things like this and the way you do. So hats off to you. I think that's really,
I hope I wasn't too embarrassing when he came to my office, because my shock levels were like unmeasurable in that moment. Like you can't be serious. You're really here with an idea that you need a philosopher on your project. Okay.
I love it. Well, I think, this might also go to this fact that, like you mentioned, in terms of biology and just biology functioning a bit differently for those who really understand the biology, and they're, I don't know. I just feel like there is perhaps more, maybe just room for that, for individuals being more appreciative than certain sciences lend themselves more to appreciation with philosophy, or there's just more of a history of it. And biology is one of those. But of course, we know there's plenty of working biologists that there is no connection whatsoever.
That's it. I mean,
there's problems to be solved, and there's things to do, and that's totally okay as too. But
yeah, you have to get lucky. You definitely have to get lucky, and I mean, in part, that's why someone reading my CV might be like, hey, he doesn't work on developmental biology. And it's like, no, I didn't before, but hey, the opportunity has presented. Yeah. I have gotten lucky enough to have the chance to, so I do now. And I think that's that kind of flexibility, if you want to work on practice concerns, I think that kind of flexibility is pretty important.
Yeah. I love it. All right. So that's really exciting to me. One of the things I wanted to ask about is I noticed you have what is termed the Pence Lab, and it is the institutional sort of, or the structuring of your research program, as well as the folks that you do. And you actually you have a section here called research products. Tell me a little bit about what went into your design of forming your lab, because I've thought about this a lot. Yeah. If I were to come into a professionalization and decide to organize a lab, I find it interesting where obviously a philosopher, an HPS scholar, does not have a traditional bench laboratory situation setting, yet they utilize the metaphor or the terminology of a scientist in many ways with a lab or laboratory. Well, tell us about your approach to this, why you think it's important, and why you sort of use the terms that you do, because I just think I think the structuring of this is really important.
That's a really great question, and it's funny because I've occasionally gotten pushback about this. There have been people who are like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Like, this isn't, you're a philosopher. Come on.
That's too bad.
Yeah, but I think
reasonable. I guess reasonable for you to defend it then. Like, yeah,
exactly. Like that's by which I mean I have an answer to this question because I've had to have an answer to this question for people before. And I think for me the answer is largely, first of all, it's about collaboration.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I think is really important, at least for me, and I'm lucky enough. So, my institutional home inside of my department is a small research center that I'm also the director of. That's got 3 faculty and a bunch of postdocs and PhD students. It's a lovely place, CEFICES at Université Louvain. So shout outs to my colleagues there. And this is a thing that's really, I think, shared across our center is, I think, an emphasis. I think we have left behind the days when we can do solo armchair careers.
Yeah.
And I think for the better. I think this is good. I think I do better work when I'm collaborating than when I'm not. If I compare my co-authored stuff to my single-authored stuff, except maybe in the case of books are a different kind of beast. But I mean, setting that aside, in terms of papers and small projects, I'm absolutely a better scholar when I work together. And so foregrounding that is the first thing. And so foregrounding, and I was trying to wrestle with this, like, how do I foreground the expectation that I want people to do that, right? That I want to create that environment where we're around, we see each other, we work together, we collaborate, we co-author papers, we have reading groups, we thrive on this kind of real interactive environment. And that's one of the big reasons that I thought that the kind of lab terminology made sense. The other big one comes from the digital humanities perspective, which is we also are, that side of our work is kind of like being a sort of tech lab in the sciences. So I actually did some, when I was late in high school and early in undergrad, I did some work in a bio lab. And the lab that I worked in was that they were good at a technique. Right. And they didn't really care what they applied their technique to, but they were there and they had a group and they had their machinery and they had their protocols and they cranked out the work. And that's kind of been how I've seen a lot of my orientation with respect to the digital humanities and philosophy. It's like, look, we got a group of people who know how this stuff works. We got data, we got protocols, we know how to run these and that kind of analyses. Call me, and in that sense, I think that also lends itself relates to nice catch. I thought for a long time about what to call the research products page, because it's not just papers and books, right? It's also code and it's data sets. And it's broader than just being a publications thing, because our work is broader than we produce more than just good old fashioned academic publications. And I wanted to make the people who were doing that stuff feel like they were doing something that was valuable, that was academically worthwhile. It's not just, it's not a paper, so don't worry about that.
Yeah. It's like, no, you've contributed to this data set. You've contributed to this. We've written a program or done something that's going to be a part of the process. The gold standard is not just the paper in a high impact journal.
Yeah. And I mean, to that end, I also like that. I think it helps too, because I try to be really sensitive to alt-ac career paths, because I think that's an extremely important thing for anybody sitting in a tenured faculty position who's not thinking about alt-ac careers for their people is delusional.
Doing a disservice. It's crazy.
And I'm happy to be that provocative about it. One of the job placements that I'm proudest of is a former postdoc of mine who is now a data scientist.
Fantastic.
And I like that. That is
a great
not,
career.
Yeah. That's, you're crazy if you think that that's a failure, right? And there are absolutely people in our business who think that so sad. I somehow failed because that's not a real, no, that's a great job. He's doing what he wants to be doing in the place that he wants to be doing it. And it is amazing that a little bit of work with digital humanities could serve as the leverage that he needed to kind of reorient a little bit professionally and have this start to open up. And I mean, I'm just immeasurably happy that happened.
I am all for encouraging that sort of those other kinds of careers and support. I think, from my experience, what it comes down to is a lot of those faculty they don't know anything else. And so they can't provide that kind of support. They can't even think outside of the world of academia. They just can't. And I mean, I think you'll be happy to notice that the young scholars, the ones who are sharp, or just even not, they get it and they're aware. I think, they're less and less is it it is, you would hope that they're getting the support. And I think, there are students that probably will fall through in terms of not getting it, but there is sort of a growing sort of an awareness about, the need for these kinds of there's just other things that one can do, and how to go about doing it is important and relevant. And I'm glad to hear there are folks like you who are providing that kind of support to your students. So appreciate that.
Crossing fingers. It still isn't easy, but I think we have to get better. We have to get better.
Yeah. Well, why don't we lead into, we've discussed a number of things and we could keep going. I would love to keep hearing. I could probably say, what's another thing you have going? You're like, well, there's this other project over here. And here's this one that's going to come out in 6 years or in 6 months. So I appreciate that, but we probably have to I want to be cognizant of time. And, once again, yeah. But for those of you who want to find out more about Charles Pence, you can check out his website, the Pence Lab, tons of really cool stuff. But I wanted to follow up with the last question, which is, what do you see as the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And I think one thing I'm gonna offer something. This is just shockingly off the cuff, but I'm gonna give this a whirl. One thing that I think that we've seen in recent years is a kind of proliferation of specializations and sub-subspecializations and sub-sub-sub-sub-sub-specializations in the philosophy of science. And on the one hand, I completely get this. I've studied discipline formation. This is how this works, right? We get, bigger and bigger literatures about smaller and smaller questions. And so it becomes harder and harder to be an expert. And I don't even want to I certainly don't want to sound like I'm somehow calling for a return to the days when everyone everywhere was a general philosopher of science. But one thing that I think is going to be a real challenge, just because I struggle with this myself, is I want to be doing work that integrates insights from these other specializations inside the philosophy of science. I don't, like I say, I don't see myself becoming a general philosopher of science. That's not what I mean. But I want to do work that's informed by pragmatist philosophy of science. I want to do work that's informed by feminist philosophy of science. I want to do work that's informed by philosophy of science in practice. I want to do work that's informed by philosophy of chemistry and physics, even though I don't do philosophies of chemistry and physics or social sciences or economics, right? And for me, that's really been an interestingly difficult thing. As we get more and more specialized, trying to figure out how, again, without trying to counteract that, but figuring out how we can still be informed by what one another are up to. And that's not even to mention outside of philosophy of science into the rest of philosophy, right? Where the problem gets even worse. I want to be better at that, and I don't know how. And I don't think I'm alone in talking to people about that as a kind of worry.
No, I appreciate that. With this, this is a problem I typically contextualize in terms of like a problem of hyper specialization. And I appreciate though your clarification of, because you don't want to say it's sort of like to go polar and say, okay, well, we don't want to hyper specialize. We want to go back to being general philosophy of science, philosophers of science, because that was sort of the reason, that part of the motivation for some sort of in practice approaches and specialization is that people were there seemed to be too much of a overgeneralization in terms of this is how science worked that wasn't representative of how it actually worked or how it was being done in practice. I'd be open to suggestions too. And I appreciate this sort of the open-ended question and open-ended challenge, and hence why it's a great challenge, because what do we do about this? And what do philosophers of science who are doing, who have, even found themselves in a subdiscipline of philosophy of evolutionary theory or something like that. There's there's 5 different subdisciplines of philosophers in that specific area, and so
right.
that they only know about too. So me coming in as a philosopher of psychology or cognitive science, I wouldn't even know what you're talking. I wouldn't even refer or understand. But yeah, and the question of to what degree is this just important? Like, is it important just for awareness or knowledge to be able to understand and talk amongst themselves? Is it how important or relevant is it for this hyper specialized work to be sort of taken on by others, or like? To what do we need? Like, is there sort of is the professional perceptions of philosophy of science? Is that what we're going for, rather than it all needs to weave together or something like that? Like, no, and I think much in the same way that same kinds of calls that we get, for example, for interdisciplinarity, right? The kinds of problems that we're dealing with now are so big. If we want to be able to talk about climate change, we can't just talk about it from a single disciplinary perspective. There's a version of that same argument that works for a lot of the problems that we're wrestling with in contemporary philosophy of science, right? If we're gonna talk about scientific understanding or scientific explanation or causality or something, like we've got to have a view that's not just, here's how I think this works in mid-20th century evolutionary biology. I love that. So, I was wrestling with the same kind of sort of entanglement of concepts, but more specifically within a particular science. And the thought was, if you can't, if you want to talk about, you can't talk about validity without, you can't address the concept of validity. For me, it's in psychiatry without, sort of impacting conceptions of progress or conceptions of explanation. But what you're doing is taking it a step up to you can't talk about this concept from a philosophical standpoint without considering like another version of that, of a philosophy of this concept in this other domain. And I think that would be an interesting methods paper or even book to be addressed, of like, it's very high level, or it's very sort of like meta almost, but I think it's like, I'm trying to get there.
I find myself doing too much meta philosophy these days, I think, but it's what happens. Maybe it's my midlife crisis. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I love thinking about, it's good to do this stuff and just continue on, but there's something there. So I appreciate you sharing that. But anyway, Charles, it was a real pleasure getting to talk with you. Thank you for taking some time this evening, and enjoy the rest of your Friday in Brussels, in the downtown area. It sounds lovely. So. Thank
you so much. This was a great time. I'm really excited to have been invited. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
No problem. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.